Yep, I actually did it. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky angle where I talk about electronic music, both new and old, and today, I'm talking about, Autechre's NTS sessions 1 through 4. Yes, I'm still pronouncing it Autechre, sue me. Oh boy, I've been more than a little hesitant to cover these guys again. Last time I gave Sean Booth and Rob Brown a full video was in my most popular and probably most infamous review to date, that of their LSEC 1 through 5 project in 2016. Well, I'm not going to take back anything I said in that video. Maybe some opinions on individual tracks have changed and there's some stuff that I could have worded better, but that's about it. I'm obviously still pronouncing their name Autechre. I've gotten at least 20 different corrections by lots of people over the years, and I don't really want to hear it anymore. Whatever pronunciation you go by is also correct, be it Autechre, 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 or Autechre, whatever you like. It really doesn't matter, and I don't want to make the video about that. Now, I probably could have explained my perspective on these guys better than I did in the LSEC review. There I was poking fun at them a fair bit, since at the time I wasn't expecting the video to get as much traction among the serious fans as it ended up getting, but I'll put it into clearer terms now, since I know how many people absolutely love the crap out of everything they do and take them super seriously. Okay, so personally, I have a bit of a weird relationship with these guys. First of all, I consider Autechre an absolutely necessary force in electronic music. No other band or artist I've ever covered, not even RDJ himself, has done so much work to push this genre to its very limits and come up with so many creative and interesting ideas and continue to stay ahead of the curve even this late in their career. On top of that, even though I tend not to take people who obsessively worship their favorite bands and artists all that seriously, it makes perfect sense to me that these guys have that religious following. Am I gonna bow down to them myself? But their releases are not the kind of thing that I can ever really criticize much, since they happen to be so out of the box and forward-thinking, and they're so consistent despite how freaking many releases they've put out over the years. Sean Booth and Rob Brown do not seem like they're of this earth more often than not. And I find that I nearly always enjoy myself whenever I put one of their albums or EPs or whatever else on. Super talented guys. I like them a lot, for sure. However, I think it would be a stretch to say that I love them. They've never really done all that much for me emotionally, just in general. Like, some albums are definitely worse than others, but even my favorites from them, I wouldn't say are, like, a huge part of my life. They have a lot of stuff that I would consider great, and very little that isn't at least good to me. But also, nothing of theirs that really throws me over the top like that, elicits major gushing out of me, and is the kind of thing that I just put on all the time. See, that's the thing, I very rarely am specifically in the mood to listen to their stuff, even though, again, whenever I do, I come out glad I did. Really, the only album of theirs that I get enough out of emotionally to put on a semi-regular basis is their first album, Incunabula. There's a couple of other tracks here and there that really get me, like Silver Side from Amber or Seafern from Confield, and there are other albums of theirs that I just enjoy the crap out of every time I put them on. Xi, Try Repeat, Quaristus. I remember also really loving Untilted, though it's been a while since I've heard that one. It's kind of hard to explain, really. I don't think they're overrated. I think they deserve all the hype they've gotten, but I consider myself more of a surface-level fan of these guys than most people seem to be. Sometimes feel like I'm almost liking the band out of obligation as a fan of electronic music, because their craft and production and sound design is so undoubtedly top-notch, and their place in the genre is so heavily revered. Listening to Autechre to me is like watching number file videos, though. They're absolutely fascinating, but most of the experience is entirely cerebral, save for maybe a little Matt Parker here and there occasionally to add a little more energy. And it's great every now and then, but definitely not all the time. If you want someone who enjoys their stuff on a much deeper level than I do, obviously there's Oliver from Deep Cuts. He's done a couple of videos on them, including an in-depth breakdown of this particular release, which he tackles with a lot more enthusiasm than I'm probably going to myself. I presume most people watching have already seen those videos, but if you haven't, definitely go check them out later. I do know that when I looked up and saw the fact they released this 4-part thing that clocked in at 8 hours, twice the length of even freaking LSEC, I was just like, you know what, I think I'm gonna pass on this one. But then I commented this standpoint on Oliver's video and I got like 20 comments telling me, no, you have to listen to all of them, like right now, they're really the greatest albums of all time again, and stuff like that. Every new Autechre release is objectively the greatest album of all time, remember that? I don't think anyone actually directly said that, but whatever, I'm sure someone will. I decided that I kinda had to slug through all these anyways, though. I mean, I'll admit, I almost never actually look forward to new Autechre, especially when there's this freaking much of it. If these guys would please just release something in an hour-long or even 2-hour-long chunk, I couldn't be happier. Now their next album's probably gonna be like 24 hours or something, and the fans are gonna bug me even harder to slog through those, because, oh, it's more accessible this time. I don't know, an 8-hour release by definition is not accessible, but whatever. I listened to all the sessions anyways. 3 times each. 3.5 really, if you include false starts. And here are my thoughts. So, big surprise, I do not think these guys really pulled off keeping me interested for 8 straight freaking hours. I don't think any artist could pull that off, honestly, not even Orbital or BT or any of my other favorite artists, but given how I was able to sit through LSEC and come out of that not feeling sick of them in general, and like they actually justified the vast majority of it, I thought they'd be able to pull off something similar here, but not so much. There is definitely good stuff in here, but I don't think I got as much out of this percentage-wise as I did out of LSEC. And another thing, I will say I really cannot recommend for people to listen to all 4 parts of this project in one go. Unless you're a really, really huge fan of these guys. Which I know there will be plenty of people who can make it through the whole thing in one day feeling entertained. I couldn't. This was just far too much for me. First listen of this thing saw me digesting the whole thing in one go. I was burnt out at the end of NTS 2 and wanted to jump out the window at the end of NTS 3. I need breaks in between each of the 4 sessions, and even then, if it's more than 2 a day, I come out completely exhausted. I think they're better treated as 4 separate 2-hour albums, and even then, they could feel pretty overly long in many parts. There was a part of me who just wanted to throw this video out altogether, and I even set up a vote on Twitter wondering what my followers thought, and the vote somehow wasn't a complete shit-out, which was a surprise, but I also felt like I've spent too much time trying to properly wrap my head around this stuff not to go all the way and finish it. So yeah, trouble is, while NTS definitely has a lot of fantastic moments all over it, I can't bring myself to say I think this delivers their best work consistently. I think it speaks a lot more to LSEC's quality that I can look up at that project and feel like I'd be able to make it through all 4 hours of that no problem. Sure, I'd love to shave an hour off, but there's so much creative and out-of-the-box material that I found so interesting in investing that I still have the entire project on my iPod, even the stuff that I didn't like as much. This one, I'm probably going to pick and choose a couple of tracks I like from each volume. I'll probably just keep the 3rd one in its entirety, and yeah, that'll be it. None of the other stuff is bad, but there's definitely stuff that I don't think would be quite as impressive without the insane lengths. There's like an hour and a half of genuinely great material, if I'm a little generous. 3.5 hours of good to alright material. 2 hours of okay material, and I'll end. Which, I'll get to all end. Complicated feelings on that one. Now, Oliver did actually have a really good point on this stuff in his video. He said that this kind of stuff is much more akin to ambient music. I mean, and that's not including the stuff on here that literally is ambient music. Even some of the more beat-centric material is just meant to be enjoyed more for the atmosphere and the vibe than it is for the the construction. It's created as a kind of musical world to immerse yourself in instead of paying attention to all the little minute details. I mean, that Autechre tracks are well constructed is already kind of a given at this point. It's been so well established by everything they've ever done. This is so large in scale that trying to obsess over minute details is probably not the best use of your time anymore. I mean, you can if you want, since the details are still there, but I mean, heck, a lot of these pieces are actually on the more simplistic and repetitive side, and not very much of this material is all that abrasive or noisy either. I think the noisiest track on here still doesn't really hold a candle to some of the noisiest stuff on LSEC. And I will admit, that can definitely make it easier for me to wrap my head around. And it's not like nothing changes over the course of any of these tracks, but things tend to happen really slowly. Like, elements are just introduced and then they're gently taken out and some other stuff comes in to replace it. That's cool and all, but it doesn't really help that all these sessions were kind of spotty and all over the place for me, which made me feel the ridiculous length all the more, especially in those early lessons. Not so much now, but yeah. So I'll go down session by session, starting with NTS 1. Now, NTS 1 actually does start out pretty strongly. T1A1 starts out with these kind of like helicopter street sounds in the intro, and transitions into this slow plodding beat that's actually pretty satisfying, gets creepier as time goes on. It's a very nice opener to this thing. And the bleeping abstract beats of BQ, BQ, BQ are almost kinda catchy. Pretty fun track there. There's two pretty good ambient pieces on this session in the form of the chopped up and lively Carefree counter dronal, and the more atonal but light and dreamy closer 32A Reflected. Heck, I do think this entire first volume is pretty solid. The lowest point is probably Debris Funk, which is not remotely funky and devolves into rhythmless debris by the end. It's just kind of an track for me. And L3 Control, while a little better, more energetic, has some of those screeching synth pads accompanying it, much like those on many tracks from LSEC. I don't know, still isn't that fun to listen for me. At least the beginning of that one. It does get better near the end. There's also a set of 3 long-form ambient techno tracks that are basically just kind of indistinguishable from one another, almost, with North Spiral, Gonk Steady 1, and 4-7. I suppose they do all have their own interesting things, but they do really go seamlessly into each other, especially the latter two. Gonk Steady 1 is probably the best of those 3, has the most progression and substance going on it. Though 4-7 also has this old-school artificial intelligence vibe to it that I quite enjoyed too. That's the thing, I liked pretty much everything in NTS 1, but I don't love anything in it either. Gonk Steady 1 is probably the strongest track in the bunch, but it's not one of the best things I've ever heard from them. They've had more interesting and substantive stuff in the past. I do think NTS 1 is a pretty solid collection of stuff. Maybe a light 7.3 out of 10 overall by itself. Just kinda wish I could rate it higher than that. Yeah, sorry I'm going all pitchfork with this one. I just don't like the idea of listening to all 4 of these in one package a second time. I think it's fair to rate the 4 volumes separately as well as all together. Anyways, moving on to NTS 2. This volume starts out strong with the first 3 tracks as well. LEC97HRS probably should have been the real Debris Funk. Among all the detailed sounds of electronic debris flying everywhere, it's got some real groove in there with one of the more engaging and danceable beats on here, even a pretty neat bass line in the beginning. Maybe a bit of a stretch to call this one funky. It does devolve into complete insanity by the end because of course it does. But that is a very solid start, and I like that whole track. 6 of 8 Midst transitions pretty cleanly out of the previous track, mainly carried by a slower and more abstract but almost hip-hop-esque beat, with plenty of industrial weirdness coming and going throughout, and xflood has lots of atonal ambience and hard-hitting, satisfying beats, with one little low-mixed whistling loop that helps make it catchier. Though unfortunately afterwards it kinda slowly starts to slide off. Like a gonk tough high, it's a lot more abstract and offbeat than its similarly titled counterpart from NTS 1. Sounds like someone is like repeatedly hitting a door in many parts here. That's a window though. It's cool, but not as good as Gonk Steady 1. And going on from Dummy Casual Part 2, The album kinda really starts to drag after this. That particular track is alright, but the next track, Violvoik, it's pretty much the same as Dummy Casual Part 2, albeit weirder, much longer, and much more of a slog. It's like they made a beat out of one of those springy doorstop things that some people have attached to their walls, like the thing that goes... And I mean, it's an interesting idea to start with, but it just goes on forever, god. It does bounce back a little with the next two tracks, which somehow are both under 3 minutes. Did not expect that in a release like this. Between those two, Sinistral AB Air is certainly the more interesting one. Pretty dramatic and atmospheric atonal stuff that shows that I bet these guys could totally make a shorter album again if they wanted to. Wet Jealous Casual Interval isn't as special, but you know, it lives up to the title. I don't know what Wet Jealous means, but it's a casual interval. Just an ambient interlude. E0 is... I guess that's probably a favorite from this volume, with a strong melodic ambient foundation and an intriguing acoustic heavy beat. It creates a nice psychedelic vibe that's a lot like a more low-key and simpler FSOL. But what keeps me from getting more enthusiastic about it is that, just like a track like Istra before it, this overstayed its welcome. It did not need to be 15 minutes, and did not quite have the progression or immersiveness to really justify it. I think 8 would have perfectly sufficed. Certainly not the worst case of overextension on this album, but I don't know if I was into it enough to fully excuse it. Then, after a non-consequential 5-minute interlude in Peel MA, we get another track that did not really engage me much at all in 9 Crow, which was just a boring and draining sea of random buzzing percussion that went on for 15 more minutes. Now, obviously, I've never been into this noisier and percussive side of their style, and maybe it says more that I didn't come out outright annoyed by it, but I didn't really find much personal enjoyment in it. Just found it boring more than anything. The closer here, though, Turbile Epic Casual Stipple Idle, that was a return to form. The atmosphere here was really well done, with these pulsating little synth licks getting covered in an insane amount of reverb. And I swear there's even some infrasonic frequencies there too. There are often sections of this track where I just spontaneously get a headache, and it's always the same sections, no less. Yeah, there must be some low frequency sounds that you can't really hear there, because it feels like it's designed to sound like it's just physically weighing down on you or something. Even though I'm not typically into that kind of thing, I don't actually mind that. I think it's like a reference to the occult and how infrasonic frequencies make people think that they're seeing ghosts. The track already had a heavily ghostly vibe, why not add to it? And I think it does work. I'm not 100% sure if the idea was enough to carry the entire 20 minutes. Now, I want to make it clear again, this isn't just me complaining that the track is 20 minutes. Gong Steady 1 was 22 minutes, and that used its time a lot better than some of these longer 15-minute tracks on NTS 2. It's about how well that time is utilized, and I'm not going to stand here and say I don't think Autechre can do better than some of this stuff. NTS 2 by itself is probably overall a 6.7 out of 10 for me. It started out really well, certainly has brilliant moments, but too much of it felt like a slog. So then that takes us into NTS 3. This was easily the volume that took me the longest to process in my mind. Most of my listens of this thing ended up quite similar to my usual thoughts whenever I put on draft 7.30. I listened to it and thought, you know, there's nothing I can really point to that's wrong with it or that I can take specific issue with, but why isn't it doing more for me? I did eventually come around on it, though, when I just sat down and put it on the visualizer in iTunes and paid close attention to it. So then I came around on it, and I now believe that NTS 3 is the best of the 4 sessions. NTS 1 was definitely more consistent, and my enjoyment of this one fluctuated more, and that did also confuse me for a while because the actual sound of NTS 3 is actually fairly consistent. Most listens of this thing blended together everything from TT1 PD up through 9 Fly, and not until the third listen was I able to fill in that mess of blank space, in my opinion. But I do think the high points on NTS 3 were higher than those on 1. It is the volume I most likely see myself revisiting. Now once again, most of my favorites are right at the beginning, like the opener Clustro Casual may very well be my favorite single track in the whole collection. It's some really well done atmospheric ambient techno that reminded me of some early period Monolake, except maybe at half speed. And Splesh was almost just as enjoyable, creating this really cavernous atmosphere that really captivated me, and even including a nice melodic outro that was a nice touch for sure. It then moved into the industrial, slowly moving mess that was TT1PD. Again, a highlight for me as the longest track. It had among the biggest amount of compelling ideas within it. Maybe I was a little disappointed to hear a good bass line in the very beginning that got abandoned really quickly, and the entire piece devolving into the usual abstract insanity by the end, but its menacing vibe was actually pretty consistently enjoyable, and that vibe was kept up throughout the majority of this whole volume. We did hit a bit of a dud right after that, though, in Acid Moine Idol. Another track that way overstayed its welcome and ran an otherwise kinda intriguing setup into the ground. Ironically, this doesn't really have any acid synths in it. It's mainly characterized by this fuzzy horn section that kind of blares the same fifth over and over, with some other electronic texture surrounding it. It definitely sounds pretty cool initially, but there's really not much progression. The progression in this track is like at a Steve Reich level, where all the sounds are like moving at slightly different speeds and slowly falling out of sync with each other. It just kind of ends up with this track feeling like the equivalent of a passing freight train and you getting stuck at the crossing for 12 minutes. Like, just, come on. After that, there's the maybe intentionally awkward FLH, which sounds like if it bothered to try some more traditional harmony and those beeping synth leads, it could have ended up at some like early Elliot Lip type straight synth funk. But everything is just off, leading it to feel heavily robotic instead. Like it ended up on the wrong side of the uncanny valley. Or maybe not quite, because I didn't find myself very creeped out by it. I did find it to be an interesting idea though, and I guess it's a pretty alright track. And it did pick up a lot more again with Gloss Ceramic, which basically picked up where TT1PD left off, carrying those same menacing industrial vibes. And this track is almost like a three-parter, sorta. First having these overblown acid-esque synths carried up by some otherwise light and chill percussion, but halfway goes all atonal and has these weird glassy metallic synth or percussion sounds that are pretty distinctive. And by the end, it just evolves into that glassy sound, but sustained and covered in reverb. It's quite an interesting and dynamic track there. It's a very nice highlight for me there. Now the next track, G1E1, almost feels like an interlude despite being just short of 7 minutes. Just so you know the scale of this album is getting to you by this point. There's not very many elements that go into this one. It's just this one tonal clanking synth along with this jerky humming melody that carries over most of it. It sounds vaguely Indian for some reason. Okay. And Nine Fly didn't feel like the most consequential thing either. It just felt like the same rusty old machine that is operating properly, but it's squeaky, and it's just going on for 10 minutes. Then finally, after welcome break into some cold and windy atonal ambience with Shimripl Air, we close out the volume with Ikari, another almost 20 minute, slowly evolving piece that I wanted to like a lot more than I actually do. I do actually think it set up this really intriguing low-key vibe initially, the kind of thing you're gonna solve mysteries to. Thought I even heard some synths in early parts that sounded almost like psychedelic guitars. Trouble is, with this track, once again, I think it kind of overstayed its welcome. Or maybe it didn't, like it keeps the mysterious vibe throughout, but after a while, some of the more intriguing ideas kind of trailed off, and after a while it became less about top-secret covert operations and more about some security guard surveying the same area for several hours. It had the potential to be one of the best tracks in the entire package, but ultimately my engagement kind of trailed off in the second half. I don't know if I can honestly mark it as a big favorite. So yeah, overall, as I said, NTS 3 is the one that's taken me the longest to pin down how I even feel. I'm still a little mixed on it in some parts, but it is probably the strongest volume by merit of having the biggest highlights and most intriguing ideas. There are unfortunately still a bunch of tracks that despite having good ideas I'm just ambivalent on for whatever reason. I'm still not actually able to explain in words. And Asin Idol is probably a lower point for this album than Debris Funk. Even if it wouldn't have been, if it had been cut down to 4 or 5 minutes or so. It's a tough call. I guess I'll lean into those better tracks and give it a 7.5 out of 10. And then finally, the final volume in the package, NTS 4, is, unfortunately my least favorite of the 4. Now I will readily admit, it's mainly just because of one track. And I can't even really call that track bad either. And, I'll get into it in a minute. I think you probably already know which one I'm talking about, but let's start with the other tracks. Frame Casual is our opener, a metallic and murky mix of atonal ambience. Makes for some well-executed atmosphere once again. Not very beat-heavy, but it's so dense and heavy-sounding, like a sea of liquid metal. Mirage, meanwhile, is very light and airy, though similarly spooky. I will say this track did sound like it'd have a bit of compression issues in some parts, though that could just be on my end, I don't know. And then suddenly we transition into Column 13, which is another one of my favorites in the entire package, and easily my favorite on this session. It's so bright and melodic, almost pastoral, too. Like Bibio had some say in this or something. Not to say it doesn't have some dissonance and creepy in there too, but it feels like it's been ages since I heard something this almost happy sounding, like it's the first track on here that really seems to have a human warmth to it. It is a serious breath of fresh air from all the loneliness and creepiness of the majority of this entire package. Even if it does end in something that sounds like a creepy harmonica line all fuzzed out with effects. And then right after that, we go right back into that negative space with Shimripl Casual. Probably actually a little better track than the empty space that was Shimripl Air from NTS 3. This is similar, but with some buzzing rhythms, if you want to call them that, and some other little bubbly background melody lines. Not much substantial happens over the course of its 24 minutes, but it at least creates a textured and immersive space. There are other tracks on here that didn't feel like they justified even less of a time, but now we gotta talk about the album's massive closer, the 58-minute All End. And, this track is basically just a single sustained, giant, dreamy synth chord with a ton of EQ modulation as, you know, something resembling texture, maybe a subtle bass wash very occasionally, and change over time is so slow and so minor that it may as well not even be there. Save for maybe a fake ending or 2 or 3. I feel like with this track, Autechre were trying to create, like, a simulation of what it would be like after the end of the universe. And all matter and energy has just been collapsed into a singularity, or maybe just near a singularity. Except you also somehow are conscious during this state of being, which sounds incredible in concept, but when you really get down to it, wouldn't this kind of be hell? Because there's nothing. All End still exists in the real world where there's a concept of time, and it's just completely stagnant. I mean, it's a good track to contemplate these metaphysical, philosophical topics to, but to just listen to and pay attention to everything, it doesn't really give you much. Once I thought I had pinned down the kind of philosophical hugeness that they were going for, I looked at how long the piece had been going on and realized, holy fuck, I'm only like 22 minutes in. It's not even halfway through. I'd like to think I have a higher patience for long-form ambient pieces like this than most people. I mean, I can get through Brian Eno's discrete music and Neroli no problem. I've heard plenty of hour-long singular ambient pieces that I came out thinking that was alright, like Knock Plank's on several things like that, and I love Juno Reactor's Luciana. Even Autechre themselves had Perlin Subrange 636 before this, and while I'm not gonna act like that was the greatest thing ever either, it was still probably more fun than this was. This has always been the track on this album I least look forward to whenever I think about the entire NTS package. It's the one I get the least enjoyment out of. But I also can't say I think it's the worst either. It achieves that same exact philosophical hugeness that it was going for, and everything is entirely incidental. It's meant to melt your mind into nothing and cause listeners to fall into existential horror. I can't even say I thought it was straight bad either. There are other tracks in this album that actually did feel maybe half-assed by comparison, but this is a track that I don't really find rewarding. I physically am unable to pay attention to it all the way through, and it's the track I'm the most just tired and done with after I've completed it. All In doesn't even really end that climactically. It just basically abruptly fades out and then that's it. I really did not need to listen to it more than once, even though I did it anyways for some reason. The final track being out of range of my patience for this kind of stuff dragged down NTS 4 to be the least enjoyable of all the volumes, also at a 6.7 out of 10. I rated it equally with NTS 2 since this felt like it had more thought put into it, but whatever. And now for final thoughts, having to put this package together as a whole. Even though I don't particularly want to, I mean, this was initially supposed to be their residency of a radio station and like something you could just tune into and listen to for a while and then tune out. But the 4 sessions together have apparently been credited as the 13th mainline studio album from Autechre, so I guess I'll have to talk about the entire thing and how it works in that context. I'll put it this way. There's a lot of good stuff in here. Autechre, the kind of band who I figured would be able to deliver 8 hours of material and not bore you, and from the looks of the fan reaction, this has in fact been the case for most people. But personally, I cannot in good faith recommend the NTS sessions to anyone but the diehard Autechre fans, purely on the merits of it being 8 hours long. The diehard fans are going to get a life-changing experience. Already being obsessed with their stylings, they'll get exactly what they want, and then some. If you do happen to be a diehard fan who loves everything they do but somehow still haven't picked this up, absolutely do so. But for everyone else, people who weren't sure if they wanted to pick this one up or have been on and off with Autechre like me, I don't know if it's really worth bothering. Maybe just listen to NTS 3 and call it a night. The fact remains, Autechre have always made the kind of music that require you to have your brain turned on and give their stuff multiple spins in order to enjoy them to the fullest extent, and the NTS sessions are no exception. I'm sure if I had had the patience to listen to the full package twice more, I could possibly end up getting all the way up to Oliver's level of enthusiasm for this. But it's 8 goddamn hours long! I just barely put in enough listening time for me to have solidified, verbalized opinions on all of this, and that's after over a week with the only real break I had to write another review was the Zuluk video. I mean, I'm not outright opposed to the idea of going through the whole thing again, but realistically I don't think I will. Maybe I'll come back to certain tracks, or just pop up NTS 3 in its entirety, or maybe NTS 1 if I'm really in the mood for it. But definitely not all 4 in one go. That's why I think it's a lot better to separate the full package down into the 4 volumes. Because that way they're in much more manageable chunks, and you can take breaks in between. Sure, the 4th one really does feel like an ending, and can't fully be separated from that context. I still find it much better enjoyed this way. Yeah, this is now officially the longest album I've ever had the pleasure of sitting through and fully digesting, and quite frankly, I hope to keep it that way. If Autechre's next album really is like 24 hours like I jokingly predicted, I'm gonna be passing on that one entirely. And no, I'm also not listening to AE Live either. While that is broken down into 9 actual hour-long chunks, and that was probably much less ambitious an undertaking than this was, I just don't have the patience for that much freaking Autechre. As I mentioned before, nothing would make me happier at this point if they just released an album of just 1 hour of what they consider their top-notch material. And feels doubtful that they will at this point, but it's worth hoping for. So for the final overall rating on NTS sessions 1 through 4, I could take the average of my enjoyment of the 4 volumes and say I'm feeling a solid 7, I mean, it's good enough that I don't feel like my time was outright wasted, I will say that. And while I do feel like I got a lot of reward out of this release, and that setting aside so much time was at least partially worth it, I still don't think it was enough to completely justify how inconvenient it was to properly digest the whole thing. Taking that into consideration, I think 6.7 might be more accurate, unfortunately. But when you really get down to it, I know the fans aren't gonna give a shit about what I have to say. This is too big to fail, was what it is. Autechre could release a full month of material. I'd scream why, the fans would scream back, you try making something that long, the length alone is an achievement. I guess, if you think quantity alone is really that worth celebrating. I'll admit there's definitely quality material here that I'm glad I did sit down with. I just wish they'd focus more on quality over quantity in general. So yeah, I think all fans will find something to enjoy out of it, but I would say only check out the whole thing if you think you'll have the time to, and think you're likely to enjoy it from past experience with these guys. Yeah, I'm overall feeling too big to fail out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of angry ones. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. If you want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, preferably not AE Live. Well, the link to my Patreon is in the description down there, so check that out. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.